The question is, does a higher level of underlying intelligence increase the likelihood of learning issues? Well, that's an incredibly good question, and I'm going to try and address it right now. But first of all, we've got to answer a few other questions, and one of them is, what is intelligence? What are we talking about? Is it the amount of knowledge we have? Is it the ability to understand concepts as opposed to knowledge? Is it skills? Or is it the speed with which learning takes place? Or is it just the underlying potential, the capacity to learn? Or maybe it's a combination of all of those. Well, this is confusing already to start. But, we often talk about professors who are eccentric. They're brilliant at writing scientific papers. They're at cutting edge. But if when they've finished work, they go out to their car and their tyre is flat, some of them haven't got a prayer on how to change it. This overlap between genius and idiot is one that's puzzled generations. Also, what confuses us is the fact that entrepreneurs, billionaires even, some of them can't get a date. Some of them have ADHD. Some of them barely read. Yet in their businesses, wow, they fly. What's all this about? And then, of course, we often come across Asperger's sufferers, and I came across once he could recite the whole phone directory, but he couldn't do up the buttons on his shirt. So that's another form of eccentricity. I did a project in a jail once in Britain, and it was full of criminals, and some of them had got this amazing reputation of running rings around hundreds of detectives that were chasing them. But they still can't read and write themselves. So if someone can be highly gifted, very knowledgeable, very skillful in one area, does that mean that they must have, or even might have, the potential to be that gifted, that skillful, that intelligent in other areas, just that it's not yet developed? So if that person with Asperger's, who I also met, who knows every statistic of every NFL player in the last 20 years, does that give him hope that he can develop social skills, get some friends? Well, sadly, our experience up to now has suggested in the main that's not going to happen. These things don't usually change. So for many, the limitations in development of learning ability shows up early on in childhood, and it becomes a characteristic that can mark them the whole of their lives. It's almost like the brain just has one serious chance, one serious go at getting it right. There's a short window for each specific aspect or type of development. And if it gets it wrong, then it seems that that's it. Well, early childhood experiences, of course, play a massive part in these limitations. And trauma, in fact, is what forces the development of very different circuits, coping strategies. And when these circuits develop, the cerebellum is, of course, the major developer, the programmer. It's the junction box. And we know that 75% of all brain cells are in the cerebellum. There's billions of connections made there, all to make life easy, to create automatic circuits that deal with every skill, every concept, every mental process that we use all of the time. When these circuits are finished off, they can be transferred up to the cortex, where they're stored so they can be used effortlessly, making us a natural at everything we do well. But you imagine if in that very busy junction box, cerebellum, full of connections, in those early months of life at the very time when really critical connections are being developed, and remember, connections are electrical connections, and suddenly some metal, mercury or some other metal arrives there, blends in with the very white matter that was supposed to be where the crucial circuits are being developed. And remember, metals are good conductors of electricity. So imagine what happens to those circuits in development. Everything, short circuits, is connected together, and all the circuits in that area are useless. All sorts of things go wrong. Things go wrong with basic, fundamental circuits at that crucial time of cognitive development. And if that was the one chance you had of developing something fundamental, then maybe you've lost it. So when this happens to affect the circuits, say, that control eye movements, then you may well end up with a child that doesn't find reading easy, or a child that can't read situations well, or a child that can't concentrate. The impact of just that is enormous. And that, of course, triggers the next problem. A child that in many ways seems normal, intelligent, but can't learn is a child that's very difficult to understand. And they feel very out of place too. And nobody is able to explain why they are the way they are. And they don't know why the things that are easy for someone else is impossible for them. Why can he make friends but I can't? Why can she read and I can't? Why am I always in trouble and getting told off? So some of these critical skills or processes that are being developed, they're just the first layer of many layers of learning. And often each layer is dependent upon the previous layer having been properly developed. So in autism, there are usually a significant number of symptoms, often the consequence of missing the window for critical earlier layers of development. So the foundations for many more complex skills are just not there. It's kind of like a domino effect. All this, of course, is hugely traumatic for the child and for the family. And it does happen to children of even the most caring parents sometimes. So please don't be blaming the parents ever. But what's also going on in the environment on the outside? Well, the normal route for development means the child is cared for, feels safe, doesn't have to worry about anything those first few years. And that happens, of course, for most. But what about the child with an alcoholic father or a mother who's an addict? What happens when a child witnesses parents fighting, losing their temper frequently, going missing? And then what about the child who's abused physically, psychologically or sexually? Instead of feeling safe, they're scared or hurt or both. All of these things can happen in some children, sadly, at a time of crucial development. It causes fear, it causes stress, at the very time the child needs to be experiencing safety and consistency so that they can develop in the normal way. So instead of developing circuits that enable normal social skill development, forming a connection, a bond, a relationship with parents and siblings and others, they're focusing on survival. Something they really should be taking for granted, because that's what normal parents worry about, so that you shouldn't have to. So instead of enjoying, thriving, being nurtured, they're now focusing on how to survive, how to avoid the pain, get away from the fear. And they're working hard to just cope with what's going on. The skills they need at that moment are very different from the skills that should be being developed at that time. And as we've been saying, as most skills only have one window of time for development, and if you miss it, you've missed it. For instance, a child that knows no closeness with family until after the age of 2 rarely creates the type of emotional regulation skills after that age that they need, so they miss out. The one chance to develop correct, appropriate circuits has been lost, and certain skills just hit a glass ceiling. They stop developing, often with serious consequences that last right through life. So instead of the normal circuits, often a range of coping circuits are created instead, critical for survival at that time. They're kind of like alarm circuits. They're hypervigilant, looking for the things they fear that hurt. And these hypervigilant circuits, they sometimes show up as creativity later on, because they're looking hard for and making connections that others don't make. And there's many famous creatives that had a very traumatic childhood, and they become awesome musicians and artists or entrepreneurs. So we've got to ask the question, does early trauma in life increase creativity? Does it sometimes create genius? Then we've got to ask, if so, at what expense? Because a young child facing trauma is forced to take greater risks than others. And does this affect their attitude to risk in later life? Does it make them more comfortable with higher levels of risk, perhaps? So these coping strategies, have they reduced the intelligence, or have they merely commandeered the brain cells for functions we don't call intelligence? Or even worse, we might call them unintelligence. Now, they've connected those circuits to suit their immediate need, and now it seemed, nothing can be done to create the ideal circuits for essential skills. Or did they never have the capability of developing this type of skills? Well, the truth is, all of this is simply not understood the way we'd like it to at present. But let's talk about the question, what is creativity? And what happens to someone who is less afraid of risk? Well, they've got more ideas than others. They're prepared to have a go when others would be too scared. And fortune favours the brave. Well, does that mean that they might just become entrepreneurs? Well, some of the most adversely affected children show signs of genius and creativity. And many more times than not, it means intelligence. So the link between learning issues and intelligence is thus formed. But there are other reasons for making the connection between learning issues and high intelligence too. Because when we can break through those glass ceilings, and the Zing approach does just that. We know now it creates plasticity, and according to research, it multiplies the stem cells and forces new circuits to be developed, rather like pressing the reset button. And then what happens? Often we see kids going from the lowest quartile to the highest quartile in the class. Kids in adulthood couldn't read become happy readers with no more teaching. So the intelligence and many aspects of the skills and knowledge needed were always there. They just needed the completion of one specific skill to enable it to be used. So this transformation, when a catalytic intervention has forced the development or redevelopment, it's forced a breaking through of the glass ceiling, it can reveal an unexpectedly high level of intelligence. Well, these transformations happen in learning, in reading, attention, behaviour, social skills, sporting skills, but it also happens in the redevelopment of key skills in the elderly. But it only seems to happen if there is a very specific intervention that forces the development that had stopped short. And it produces remarkable results. But usually in people that already have relatively high levels of ability in one or more other areas, that eccentricity again. So is it right to say that the more intelligent a person is, the more likely they are to have a learning or development issue? Or is it just the contrast, the degree of eccentricity between a specific, obvious intelligence and another underdeveloped skill? It's a stark contrast. Well, we can't be sure unless we define exactly what we mean by intelligence and then assign meaningful ways of measuring each type of intelligence. What we can say is that certainly this seems to be the case, but at the very least we can be sure that the greater the issue someone has, by default, the greater the potential they have to improve. Hope that all makes some sense.